In the United States in particular, the idea of a juvenile curfew or keeping young people out of public space simply because they're young, no other manifestation. I mean, if the idea was to attack crime, then of course you can arrest people who are doing something wrong in public space. The idea of a curfew is explicitly to remove juveniles from public space who are not doing anything wrong. Otherwise you wouldn't need the curfew. And they're very extreme measures. I mean, the fact that they're proposed or adopted in more than 200 cities around the United States doesn't mean that they're, that there's some kind of rational or reasonable idea. In fact, just the opposite. Many of the curfews that we've researched, and almost all the ones that we are aware of, are based on some levels of irrationality that are just astounding. We studied a curfew in Vernon, Connecticut that was imposed because an 18-year-old, who would be too old to be in a curfew, was shot in daylight. And so by unknown assailants. We don't even know who the assailants were. But this was used as the idea that we ought to have a juvenile curfew at night in Vernon, Connecticut. And we studied this particular curfew. This one is particularly interesting to us because we got the actual curfew citations. It was a court case, and the city had to release the curfew citations. They redacted the names, but they released all the details. And the police, Vernon's kind of a suburban rural area of Connecticut. Connecticut's a rich state. They don't have a lot to do, I don't think. And they were able to put detailed notes on these curfew citations about what the juveniles were doing when they picked them up. And out of 400 curfew citations for 16 and 17-year-olds, and some of them quite late at night, the police recorded that they were simply playing basketball in the park. They were coming out of movies or restaurants. They were talking to friends. They were doing absolutely nothing wrong. Out of the 400 citations, there was one possession of burglary tools and one runaway, I believe, from another jurisdiction. So only 2 youths out of the 400 were doing anything that would merit police attention. So we found that curfews functioned as a remarkably efficient tool to waste police time taking law-abiding juveniles off the street. Well, a lot of people say, so what's the problem with that? We don't want kids in our purview. We just don't want to see them. A lot of curfews are adopted around the country where you have the intersection of a gentrifying area of the city or a suburb where minority youth are moving in. And the city is trying to make the area more appealing to older people, mainly whites. And the presence of groups of youths, such as in Pasadena's Old Town or Oklahoma City's Brick Town or Minneapolis's Mall of America, those kinds of areas will tend to be seen as an economic discouragement to what the city is trying to do with that area. It doesn't matter whether the kids are actually causing any problems or not. And in fact, the incidents that lead to calls for a curfew are often have nothing to do with, nothing that a curfew could solve. When we studied curfews, we found that not only do they have no provable effect on crime or public safety, most of the time the effect is somewhat negative. And the reason we found from studying these curfew citations in Vernon, Connecticut, is that the presence of young people in public actually makes public streets safer. The vast majority of young people are there for lawful or reasonable purposes. They're not causing any trouble, and by being there, they create a public atmosphere of greater safety, not less so. Again, I'm separating this from the way people feel about it versus what actually happens. And the fact that people may be afraid for whatever reason of a group of black youths or Hispanic youths doesn't mean that group is actually causing danger. And we find that actually the presence of more young people in public, we need more youth on the streets, in fact, contributes to public safety. We studied a curfew in Monrovia, California that was celebrated by President Clinton. It was a daytime curfew. It was supposed to deal with all this crime problem in Monrovia, and the police released all sorts of information that crime had gone down and so forth. And when we studied it, again, it was a court case, and they released a lot of the data on the curfew, and we found that crime actually went down much faster when the curfew was not in effect, the hours and times when it was not in effect than when it was. And this contributed to our view that actually young people or people in general in public spaces, so you don't have dark, vacant streets and alleys and so forth, the presence of a lot of people in public makes public areas safer. So a lot of this just goes back to the completely irrational attitude that we have toward younger people, these irrational fears, sort of waiting for an incident, whatever the incident is, as a justification for imposing a curfew that accomplishes very little, but it does make it appear that public officials are doing something about this. And really, you could make as good a case for putting a curfew on adults as you do on youth. If you have an emergency in your community, then you might as well curfew everyone. And of course, we're not about to do that. So young people have become very handy scapegoats for crime problems and very distressing public incidents that may have nothing to do with young people. But it's a policy that really contributes to the United States being one of the riskiest societies in the world overall for young and old alike, because we let so much irrationality infect our public policy, and so much prejudice and so much discriminatory thinking, and very little analysis of what our real problems are.